The next phase is obviously the economic component, which everybody is getting worried about. We have looked very extensively at the comparison between 2008 and what's going on right now. So obviously, the catalyst of what got into the recession is dramatically different, right? So you don't have hyper leverage in the mortgage-backed security space that causes a tipping point as the catalyst for the rest of the economy getting into recession, let alone the earth getting into recession. Obviously, the virus is the catalyst this time. What is significantly different this time versus last time is one, speed of Congress and the Senate and the administration realizing you have to deal with it much sooner than later. It is very controversial when the Fed took the interest rates all the way down to zero very, very quickly ahead of everything else. I can't necessarily say what's the right thing and wrong thing for the Fed to do. Having actually met with former Federal Reserve Bank president here in Atlanta, having him gone through that process, you don't want to overreact or underreact, but in this case, I think they made the prudent decision. So that being the case, the Fed printing a huge amount of currency is no different from last time to this time. The key difference is the speed of which they reacted first. There is still cash stuck at the local level from the last recession. So money that was supposed to be dispersed from the 2008 recession still hasn't gotten out of the system. It looks like this time they're just going to hope that if they just send all his cash out and then they go retroactively and try to figure out who was fraudulently using the money, who was misappropriating the funds, that they can recover that this time because it's such a quick emergency financing that they're really trying to provide to everybody on such a short-term basis. A catalyst event doesn't care about getting the recovery. Just because you solve mortgage-backed securities doesn't mean that there wasn't another 24 months of recession and recovery and shrinkage of the economy. Yes, we are already in a recession. Yes, the recession is going to last for a very long time. Just because the market went up for the last 3 days, I keep on hearing everybody calling me and say, hey, do you think the worst is over? I'm like, what are you talking about? Nobody's working. How do you think the worst is over? It's getting worse. And by the next earnings report, we think it's going to be obviously very down. The next earnings report after that, we think it's going to be even more down. I am hoping that within the next 2 to 3 earnings reports, that it'll start to bottom out. The election's going to be going on, so people are going to freak out about that again and figure out what the heck is going to go on after that. Once we get through the election cycle, we think there should be some level of normalcy. That doesn't mean that we're out of the woods, but that does mean that people have a sense of predictability. So we think there is going to be a checkmark recovery. So a checkmark recovery is, as you know, this collapse, at least in the unemployment market and in the equity markets, has been worse than the Great Depression. But does anybody feel like it's as bad as the Great Depression? No. I've had the opportunity talking with my grandmother and my grandfather. They've passed away since, but they were born, one in the early 1900s, and they were teenagers growing up through the Great Depression. And obviously it affected globally. When you have these conversations, at the time the market collapsed, people weren't like, oh no, I'm going to be out of a job and it's game over. There is a time, so we have already simulated how much time does it take before equity markets collapse because companies don't have any more equity, they go under or in bankruptcy, which is what the Fed is trying to do to print and what the Congress has done to basically buy up all the bad debt, write down the debt and say it's all good. But that still doesn't solve the problem, right? What happens is it'll bounce up pretty quickly, not all the way to the top, maybe about 50%, but then the tail to recovery is at minimum 18 to 24 months from now, minimum. I'm not saying recovery to 100%, just to get to the point where people feel like this is back to some level of growth and hope. But we expect that to be 36 months on the high side to start getting out of the recession. The only thing I care about is the data. The data is the truth. If you cannot find clean data that is unaltered, then it doesn't matter what you're reading. And that's why everybody's like, why aren't you watching the TV all day and night to get all your information? I'm like, relax. This data, all the data feeds are already available to everybody. I will say that if somebody has an opinion of what they think is going to happen, I really don't care. I will take it into consideration based upon your expertise within that field, but I don't even care for my own opinions. The only thing I can show you is that when I ran these simulations and run these models, it happened this way in these marketplaces. We will run it again in this marketplace and all the other global marketplaces. And yeah, it may not end up being that way in the future, but at least I know how to hedge the risk. So I look at GDP for every economy. I look at debt, both at the central bank level, the government level, and the household level. I look at employment rates, obviously, across I'd say the biggest difference from you guys looking at this information and me is I look at it for Earth. So I look at every major economy in the entire world every single week, constantly, for decades. So yes, you get kind of a feeling for the data. And then those are kind of my basic macro components that I'm looking at. And then I just take that and I zoom in. So the biggest component of volatility in the market is a relationship between productivity and credit. If you understand those two, you will basically be able to understand every single recession, boom and bust in history.